Massimo Fagioli comes to us from Villanova University in Philadelphia, where he is just beginning as a full professor in the Department of Theology. Massimo was born in Italy in 1970. Now, wait, you just give him some time. He's going to speak to us. He will have something to say, I assure you. That was 5 years after the conclusion of Vatican II. Italy, with its long and complex history, was also the setting where he was mentored by those who observed the council and wrote of its details and dynamics. After his careful study, Massimo and his wife and family came 8 years ago to the United States, where we at St. Paul in Minneapolis were enriched by his insights. He brings a highly objective understanding of the immense event that was the council. His broad cross-cultural experience has earned a respect nationally and internationally. His awareness of the council and how he speaks of it has allowed many of us to receive the amazing work of the Spirit in our own time and place over 50 years later. So it is with great enthusiasm that I welcome Massimo Fagioli to speak to us today.
Good afternoon. Yes, I was born in 1970, and to tell you the complete truth, at the end of 1970. In the second half of December of 1970. So, guilty as charged. So, it's a great pleasure to be here because this engagement comes at a very interesting time for me. The transition from the Twin Cities to Philadelphia to Villanova, that a deer in Wisconsin was not in agreement with, so we had an accident on the highway last week. So I'm here, notwithstanding that deer, that poor deer. But it's an interesting time because it is very important for people in my profession to develop ideas and understand what's happening in the church right now. So having studied the Second Vatican Council is a great blessing in general. It is a particularly important blessing at the time of the Church of Francis, because I think it's impossible to understand what's going on in the church today without knowing something of the Second Vatican Council. If you don't know anything about Vatican II, you will be exposed to any possible ideological interpretations of what Francis is doing. So I received this call to leave behind some of my more historical projects on church history of the 19th century, 18th century, and to follow closely the pontificate of Francis, which in some weeks has more to do with athletics than with academics, because it's a lot of work. So what I want to do today is to offer a few ideas, a few insights on this particular moment in the life of the church, especially in the United States, in the age of Pope Francis, looking from a very particular perspective, which I think is the key to understand the pontificate of Francis, that is the Second Vatican Council, and in particular, the role of the last document approved by the Second Vatican Council, the Constitution Gaudium et Spes. So what I will say will go into much detail sometimes to say something on Gaudium et Spes, the interpretation of the Council, but that in the end I think will be an essential element to make sense of why Francis is doing what he's doing, and why what Francis is doing is so complicated for the Catholic Church in the United States, especially. What I've called in one of my books the American problem of Pope Francis. So here I have divided my remarks in 4 sections. The first is a short introduction on the issue of Francis and Vatican II. A second section on Gaudium et Spes in the framework of the global reception of the Second Vatican Council. A third section on the reception, or the non-reception in some sense, of Gaudium et Spes in the United States. And finally, some conclusions. So, why should we talk about Francis and the Second Vatican Council? Because what happened in these last 3 years and 3 months is something that most of us thought could not happen. I remember I gave a lecture on the reception of Gaudium et Spes at Georgetown in October 2012, and the mood was very different. And I quote myself here, October the 11th, 2012, when I said, quote, "The neoliberal and neoconservative attacks on Gaudium et Spes in these last 20 years, at least, have so far paid off," end quote. And it was less than 4 months before the announcement of Pope Benedict's resignation and of the election of Pope Francis. So what happened in these last 3 years and a half, more or less, was very unexpected. And to quote a very famous line, I'm happy to report that the death of Vatican II and of Gaudium et Spes had been greatly exaggerated. So this is a key element. It's a key element that is really part of the embarrassment, of the being uncomfortable of many American Catholics, many American bishops with this pontificate, because they couldn't believe that Vatican II could come back, and especially Gaudium et Spes. I say that with all due respect. In my work, I really try to not be divisive, to talk about church history in a way that is fair, is as objective as possible. But this is really the biggest factor probably in this moment in the life of the church. So here we know Gaudium et Spes is the last document approved by the Second Vatican Council on December the 7th, 1965, is the longest document, is the most original fruit of the Second Vatican Council. What makes Gaudium et Spes different from all the others is that in the preparation of the Second Vatican Council, there was no text that was the preparation for the future Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes is an entirely original fruit of the Second Vatican Council. It is a document that looks to the future, 1965, and in these last 50 years, though, the future has become something more radical, quicker than what Gaudium et Spes thought. We have the advent of biopolitics, so the dominance of the discourse on how laws should regulate death, life, illness, warfare, modern warfare, all these things. There is a complete change of the global scene. There is a completely new relationship from the age of the 60s between religious and politics. In the 1960s, nobody was talking about political Islam, not even Muslims, and a much more complicated Catholic Church, much more diverse. So it is time, I think, because of Francis, and not only, to take a look at what Gaudium Spes said, but especially at what we did with Gaudium Spes. And here, in my profession, and also here today, I want to wear two hats always. The first one as a citizen of this world, even if not of the United States yet, for technical reasons. But so we are in an age where the world of politics, as Gaudium Spes imagined it, is very different. This is the age of populism, of anti-politics, of Donald Trump and all the rest. And my second hat is as a member of the church, where there is a pope that has been accused often by those who don't like him of being heretic, of being disrespectful of the tradition of the Catholic Church, simply, I think, because he was still teaching what Vatican II was teaching and using the same method that the Second Vatican Council was using to look at the modern world, the world the Church lives in. This introduction now is followed by a short history of the reception and of the meaning and of the reception of Gaudium Spes. Gaudium Spes, as I said, is the last document of the Second Vatican Council, but it's a document that recapitulates all of the Second Vatican Council in a sense. The very first act of the Second Vatican Council, the opening speech of Pope John, Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, of October the 11th, 1962, talks about a new order of human relations, quote. So there is Gaudium Spes there in a sense, a new look, a new view on the world. The first document that is approved formally by the bishops at the Council of October the 20th, 1962, the message to the world, has, in a nutshell, the message of the Second Vatican Council. The Church lives in this world. It is part of this world. It cannot be indifferent to what the world goes through. And so Gaudium Spes is the red line of the Second Vatican Council. It's a document that also makes much more complicated the usual assumption on Vatican II as a council that was a theological battle between the reformists or the progressives and the conservatives. There is a very important quote from Bishop McGrath, an American bishop of Panama, who said that when the discussion on Gaudium Spes started at the Second Vatican Council in '64, very few bishops were comfortable with the idea of having a document on the Church in the modern world. I quote here from an article that McGrath wrote in Spanish in 1966, quote, "The traditionalists looked at the proposal with suspicion and with humorous disdain. But also the progressive theologians, those who had drafted Lumen Gentium, rebelled against all that could amount to an empirical consideration of the world. They insisted that the council had to proceed with the accepted theological method, end quote. And so this is Gaudium et Spes, the world enters the stage of the Second Vatican Council, and it has never left, basically. It is impossible to be a Catholic Church today without considering Gaudium et Spes, which is a document that played a key role in the Church of these last 50 years, and in very different ways in all the popes of the post-Vatican II. So we know that Paul VI was very much shaped by Gaudium et Spes. Populorum Progressio, the encyclical of 1968, is a continuation of Gaudium et Spes in a sense, which is why Paul VI is very much popular in Latin America today. And in Latin America, nobody talks about Humane Vitae. And in North America, it's exactly the opposite. Nobody talks about Populorum Progressio, or almost nobody. And we're still very obsessed with Humane Vitae. John Paul II was one of the drafters, of the authors of Gaudium et Spes, in his own way. There is a very strong emphasis on Gaudium et Spes 22, on Christ the new Adam. The most important example that shows how complex Gaudium et Spes is the use or the non-use that Pope Benedict XVI made of Gaudium et Spes. And famously, Pope Benedict in 1966 called Gaudium et Spes, in German, Sorgenkind, which means the problem child of Vatican II. His view was shaped by a negative view of modern history and modern society, and very little affected by the very nuanced approach in the Constitution Gaudium et Spes. So that's one first reason why we see that Pope Francis reclaiming Gaudium et Spes is an extremely important factor. Extremely important, as you have noticed probably, Pope Francis does Vatican II without almost ever mentioning Vatican II, which is maybe typical of a Jesuit, but it's the smartest possible way to deal with Vatican II after a decade of controversy on the hermeneutic of the Second Vatican Council. That's admirable. That's one of the most intelligent things Francis is doing. He does Vatican II. He doesn't need to label this or that the Second Vatican Council. But there's no doubt that Gaudium et Spes is at the center of how he thinks. Because Gaudium et Spes is not about defining issues with a canon, with a line, but it's shaping a new approach to reality, a new theological method. And if you have followed the two synods on the family of 2014-2015, the direct issue on the table that was the issue of disagreement was marriage, family, homosexuality, and so on. But the real theological issue was, should we think with Gaudium et Spes, or should we go back to a 1950 kind of approach to reality? That was the real issue. So here Gaudium et Spes is at the center of what this pontificate is about, of what this pontificate does of the Second Vatican Council. Here, as you know, Pope Francis, as a Latin American pope, he brings a certain tradition, and Gaudium et Spes is the single most important document for the reception of the Council in Latin America. And that means something on how complicated the reception of the Second Vatican Council is in the global church. it's quite easy to write a history of the reception of the Council of Trent in a European church, where being a Catholic in Asia means being a displaced Catholic that should be in Europe but happens to be in Asia or Latin America. That doesn't work with the Second Vatican Council, and that is why this pontificate is so important, because we have a vast bibliography, we have a stable, settled narrative on what happened at Vatican II. Unless you want to go into conspiracy theories, you know what happened at the Second Vatican Council. What we don't know yet, we don't have a stable narrative or even a stable set of narratives is what happened in the post-Vatican II period. We don't have that. And that's one of the things that I'm thinking about spending a few years in the future. So this pontificate comes at a crucial moment on crucial issues, and Gaudium et Spes is at that juncture. Now, why is this issue of the Second Vatican Council, of Francis, and of Gaudium et Spes so complicated and so hot in the church in the United States? So here I will offer a few ideas, a few hypotheses that come also from my European perspective. I moved 8 years ago, and when you move at 37, it's too late to change your perspective. It is much different if you move when you move to study abroad. I came here at 37, so I still see myself very much shaped by European Catholicism, but a certain way of looking at the church and modernity. So these are a few ideas that I really offer for discussion. The first problem of Francis, of Vatican II, and Gaudium et Spes in the US is that in the United States we have two completely separated ways of looking at the Second Vatican Council, and especially Gaudium et Spes. One is the perspective of ecclesiastical history, where everything is in continuity because it has to be in continuity. There's intellectually no other option. So that is the perspective of ecclesiastical history, where there is this pope, this other pope, and nothing changes much, really. And so Vatican II is not even a blip on that screen. It's something that happened, but it doesn't make much difference. On the opposite side, there is the opposite narrative, which is what is dominant sometimes in young Catholics of a certain mentality, which says Vatican II is just a big mess like the 60s. It's part of the 60s. It's part of that, and there's no coherent picture. There's no coherent theology there. There's a number of people saying a lot of stuff, doing strange things, but right now what we have to do is clean up the mess. That's the neoconservative. That's the cultural war interpretation of these last 50 years that has become, unfortunately, part of the narrative of the Second Vatican Council in the United States. Now, all this is made more complicated by a fact, and here I have to be very honest, is that the American Catholic Church in these last 50 years has been fully a church of the Second Vatican Council. There's no question about that. In its lived history, in its practice. So that we have seen reactions against that, but it's a Vatican II church, even if those who don't like the idea, they don't know that they are Vatican II Catholics, but they are Vatican II Catholics. But there is one problem, is that the impetus, the the social and cultural side of the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council hasn't corresponded to a similarly strong engagement historiographically and theologically with the documents of the Second Vatican Council. I'll give you just one example. When I have to give students bibliography on the commentaries of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, the best possible thing you could tell them is go back to the commentaries edited by Forglimler in 1967, 1968, almost 50 years ago. That is not natural for a church that big and that rich as the United States. So that is one factor. There is another factor that is historical, is that in the United States, the post-Vatican II period, the theological policies that were enforced by bishops in the post-Vatican II church have changed much more in this church according to a certain pontificate. To be very blunt, many American Catholic, especially bishops, they really think in the idea of regime change. And we saw that with the huge impact of John Paul II pontificate and Pope Benedict's pontificate in this church, that many bishops saw really as an opening for a regime change. And you know what I'm talking about. So that is a huge force in seeing in Francis the counter-reaction and what he's saying on the Second Vatican Council and on Gaudium et Spes, and another episode of regime change that is really part of the opposition of some American bishops to Pope Francis. So these are just a few ideas on what happened historically. Now let me go deeper into why the reception of Gaudium et Spes in the United States has been, in my opinion, that's my theory, an interrupted reception, an incomplete reception. I have identified three reasons. The first one has to do with the idea that in the American Catholic Church, I would say there is a competitive church politics. I said that in an article a few years ago on the parallels between church politics and politics, where I said we have a two-party system in this political system, and we have created basically a two-party church. So the competitive nature of American church politics is part of the idea that he is my pope, but the next guy is not just not my pope, but he may be the anti-pope or something worse, which is something I've never seen or heard in other churches. I can swear that I could not imagine the amount of disrespect and contempt for Pope Francis that I have seen in these last 3 years. It is not imaginable, really. It's something, and interestingly, in the Vatican this morning there was the ceremony for the 65th anniversary of the ordination of Joseph Ratzinger, where Pope Benedict and Pope Francis were together in the Apostolic Palace, and Pope Benedict gave a very interesting speech, a very short speech. He said, "Pope Francis, I thank you because I felt protected by you, which means a lot about the others who have said bad things on Pope Francis, thinking that they were protecting Pope Benedict. So this moment has been really interesting. So here, the competitive church politics means that there are a few teachings that have become really a marker of a certain Catholic identity. For example, Humane Vitae. So Humane Vitae plays a unique role in this church that in no other Catholic church in the world plays. That's just one example. In few other churches, you see a stark difference in the quality or in the kind of bishops that were members of the National Bishop Conference until the early 80s, the Jadot bishops and the other bishops. You don't have in other countries, and that has to do with a certain interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. You don't have in other churches that polemics, especially in seminary settings or in some Catholic media outlets, this obsession with continuity, with an ecclesiology of us versus them. That is exactly the opposite of what Gaudium et Spes says. So that is a first factor that I think there is a divisiveness that is due to the competition for those who in the church who can occupy the center of the scene. The second factor, I would say, I would call it New Americanism. So you know the history of Americanism. Pope Leo XIII condemning Americanists in 1899. I think that one of the things that makes this church so important and so relevant is a slightly difference between the vision of the Second Vatican Council on the world and the vision that many American Catholics, many American bishops have on the church. I would sum it up in this idea that for many American Catholics, especially on the conservative side, but not only, it's still valid what I would call the American equation, which is what is good for the American Catholic Church is good for the Universal Catholic Church, and what is good for the American Catholic Church is good for America. So this equation is unique. You don't find that in other countries. What is lacking, I think, is a truly universal look at the world, a much more global and much less nationalist, not less patriotic, but less nationalist look at what the message of the Second Vatican Council is on how to be a church in the modern world. You could see that from the history of spinning, for example, of some people teaching. For example, Centesimus Annus of 1991 was not absolutely pro-free market teaching. In the culture of many American Catholics, it has become the passport to a completely pro-market, liberist, neoliberal. That's one example. The third factor that I think is part of the interrupted reception of Gaudium et Spes is the role of Augustine in the United States, in Catholic theology in the United States. Here, there is something. So, I was at a conference in Dublin last week, and one of the other speakers was Cardinal Marx of Munich in Germany. And in his talk, he said many, many times, our world is secular. The state must be secular, because if it's not secular, the church is less free. This is what we hear from those Christians who live in the Middle East. The best possible things for Catholics and for religious people today is a secular state. Now, I don't know how many bishops in the US would say that. That's not a matter of being conservative, being liberal. It's just a matter of how important Augustine, or a certain reception of St. Augustine, is in Catholic theology. So for one big example is that how Gaudium et Spes talks about political power, about politics, and especially of the state. And so when Gaudium et Spes talks about power, the church and political power, Gaudium et Spes acknowledges that the state, the secular state, exists. And that is the space in which the Catholic Church lives and operates. If you read the most important Catholic theologians today who deal with political theology, who write about political theology, they dismiss completely this fact that Gaudium et Spes acknowledges that the state exists, and the secular state, if you are a Catholic whose church has endorsed Mussolini and Hitler and Franco between the 1920s and 50s, you think the secular state is much better. So this is part of a particular Augustinian imprint on the North American Christianity in general, included the US Catholic Church. So simply put, I think there is a transatlantic God gap, a much secular Europe, much less secular North America and the United States, but there is, underneath, there is a transatlantic city of God gap. There is a completely different reception of what Augustine says on the two cities, on the importance of this relationship, church and the secular, that is very, very different between European Catholics, but also non-European Catholics on the one side and North American Catholics on the other side. So here, I'm approaching the conclusion. So here, I think that this document, Gaudium et Spes, is the most important document of the Second Vatican Council for the Church of today. If you talk to Catholics, ordained, non-ordained lay bishops, and you ask them about Dei Verbum, there's not much debate there, unless you're a scholar and you want, but, so on the other documents there are different receptions, religious freedom, the liturgy is a big debate, but these are documents that have become part of the experience and the culture of the North American Church. With Gaudium et Spes is a little different. It's a little different because it's a document that was drafted mostly by French and German theologians. It was a document on which American theologians and American bishops at Vatican II had very little influence, very little impact, and and the attitude of North Americans at Vatican II vis-a-vis Gaudium et Spes was quite problematic. I'll give you one example that you know, I think. When the council voted that section of Gaudium et Spes that condemns the concept of just war in a nuclear war, there was only one national group of bishops who voted against the condemnation of the morality of nuclear weapons, and those were the American bishops. For many reasons, I don't believe they, liked the idea of a nuclear war, but the first Catholic president just been elected and killed. So it is a church that since the very beginning, Vatican II had a distance, and there was a gap with Gaudium et Spes. That gap between 65 and 2013 was buffered by popes who could understand the need of the North American church for some adjustments or some time. So you have Paul VI met the expectations of many American Catholics for a firm moral stability of the Catholic Church, Humane Vitae and all the rest. John Paul II was the Pope of the, in the mind of something, of the reconstruction of the American Catholic Church after the 60s and the 70s. But he was very much a Pope of Gaudium et Spes in his own way. With Pope Benedict, we have the most popular Pope among American conservatives, a Pope who we could say ignored Gaudium et Spes as a Pope. Yes, on the positive side, as a Pope, he didn't teach anything negative about Gaudium et Spes, which is, a low bar if you want, but it is something. It is worth, considering that. So we have these three popes buffering this gap between the future of the world and the church in this world that Gaudium et Spes sees, and the view of the world and the church in the world that the American Catholic leadership sees after Vatican II, that is not exactly what Gaudium et Spes talks about. So here, there are a couple of things that I think we should consider. The first thing is that, and I take that as a great blessing, there's no way to talk about the Second Vatican Council and to understand this pontificate of Pope Francis from a perspective that considers only one geographical, cultural area. I moved from Italy 8 years ago, and it was not simple, but that allowed me to see with two eyes, and that's something that must really be part of every analysis on the Church of today and on this pontificate of today. That is very useful also to reinterpret or to be more careful when we accept those analyses that see Europe as a desperately secular place, godless place, and North America as a desperately religious place. It is much more complicated than that. And this is the first thing in which Gaudium et Spes really plays a very important role. The second thing is a plea, is that the theology of the Second Vatican Council is part of the Catholic Church and of the American Catholic Church. as I said, even those who don't like Vatican II, when they call for the fortnight for freedom in name of religious liberty, they never quote Vatican II. They quote much more often the American Constitution. They never quote Vatican II, but they are Vatican II Catholics. But this is fragile. So I think that what these tensions in this church vis-à-vis Pope Francis, they reveal that in the Catholic Church of today, if you don't take those documents of the Second Vatican Council of 50 years ago seriously, if you don't have theologians and pastors who really take those seriously and they reflect on those texts from the perspective of their own local church, it would make little sense to translate the 4,000 pages of the German commentary that was published a few years ago. So if we don't do that, those theological documents will be necessarily at the mercy of political interpretations, which is what happens often with the Catholic Church of today. The American Catholic Church is nationally the most important church in this country, and one of the most important churches in the global church. Now here, Gaudium et Spes talks about issues that are very directly touching the lives of every Catholic, of every human being that is on this earth. And what I see as an emergency is to take a fresh look at what Vatican II says, at what Gaudium et Spes says, to understand what Pope Francis is doing. If you have never heard of the Second Vatican Council, it is obvious that you will take Pope Francis as a very original, a very strange, reckless kind of leader, which is exactly the opposite of what he's doing. He's walking a very fine line, very cautiously. And so my contribution is to cast a light on some of the issues in the reception of this council and this pontificate that in Pope Francis find a very interesting historical and theological junction. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.